Maya Johnson had learned long ago that the best way to hide was in plain sight. She had learned other things too, things that could never be unlearned. Skills that lived in her hands and her eyes and her breathing the way language lives in the tongue. You don't forget how to speak your native language no matter how long you go without using it. And Maya could no more forget what she knew than she could forget how to breathe. The trick was simply never letting anyone see it. She had been Maya Johnson for 2 years now. Before that she had been someone else entirely. Someone whose name existed only in classified files buried so deep in the government's labyrinthine, record-keeping systems that even most of the people who had put them there had forgotten they existed. That person, whoever she had been, was gone. Dead, officially. Relocated in reality. Given a new social security number, a new driver's license. A new employment history that would hold up to moderate scrutiny. A new apartment in a mid-sized city where nobody asked too many questions about their neighbors. And a very clear set of instructions about how to live her new life. The instructions had been simple. Blend in, stay quiet. Don't draw attention. Never, under any circumstances, demonstrate what you can do. She had followed those instructions faithfully for 23 months. She worked as a data analyst for a logistics company, a job that was sufficiently dull that nobody ever looked too closely at the person doing it. She kept her apartment neat and unremarkable. She made friends slowly and carefully, maintaining just enough social connection to avoid seeming suspicious in her isolation, but never close enough that anyone might start asking deeper questions. She ran in the mornings 3 miles at a pace that was athletic but not remarkable. She cooked simple meals and watched ordinary television programs and read the kind of books that sat on bestseller lists. And she was, to every outward appearance, exactly the kind of person that nobody would ever look twice at. The only problem was the itch. There is a particular kind of restlessness that comes from being very good at something and never being allowed to do it. Athletes who are forced to retire young know something of this feeling. Musicians who lose their hearing know it. Surgeons who develop tremors in their hands know it. For Maya, the feeling had been building steadily for nearly 2 years. A low-grade dissatisfaction that sat just below the surface of her carefully constructed, ordinary life, like a splinter buried too deep to see but impossible to ignore. Her coworker, Daniel, had mentioned the Riverside Range in passing during a lunch break 6 weeks before the Tuesday in question. He was an amateur hunter who had been going there on weekends to work on his rifle technique, and he described the place with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered a genuinely excellent restaurant. The instructors were outstanding, he said. The equipment was military grade. The range itself stretched to 1,000 meters, longer than anything else within 100 miles. It was, he insisted, absolutely the best place in the region to learn proper shooting technique. Maya had nodded and smiled and changed the subject, and then spent the next 6 weeks thinking about it. She knew she shouldn't go. The instructions had been clear, and she understood why they had been clear. Demonstrating her capabilities, even in a controlled environment, even in front of strangers who had no context for what they were seeing, was exactly the kind of thing that could unravel the careful work that had gone into building Maya Johnson's identity. She was supposed to be ordinary. Ordinary people did not shoot like she could shoot, but she had grown tired of being ordinary, or at least of performing ordinariness, so completely that she sometimes worried she was forgetting who she actually was underneath it. She told herself she would be careful. She told herself she would hold back. She told herself she would go, take a beginner's lesson, deliberately shoot well enough to seem talented but not so well as to raise questions, and come home having scratched the itch just enough to keep it from becoming unbearable. She told herself a lot of things on the 3-hour drive to Riverside. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in October when the air had that particular quality of autumn light that makes everything look slightly more significant than it is. The world doing its annual performance of meaningful transition. Maya parked her Honda Civic between 2 massive military transport trucks and sat for a moment looking at the building through the windshield. She had noticed the vehicles immediately, had read them correctly without even thinking about it. The way you read a familiar language without consciously translating. Military presence, significant. She had also noticed the equipment being moved through the main entrance, the way the uniformed personnel carried themselves. The specific model of communications equipment being unloaded from one of the trucks. She should have driven away. She knew she should have driven away. Instead, she got out of the car, smoothed her sweater, and walked toward the entrance. Sergeant. Collins at the front desk had the look of a man who had been doing the same job for a long time and had developed strong opinions about the kinds of people who walked through his door. He sorted them quickly and efficiently into categories, and Maya clocked his assessment of her in the half-second. It took his eyes to move from her face to her clothes and back. Again, civilian, female, beginner, probably. Going to need a lot of hand-holding and would likely give up after one session when she discovered that shooting was harder than it looked in the movies. She had cultivated exactly this impression deliberately over the course of her adult life, and she could see it working perfectly in the slight relaxation of his professional demeanor, the way his voice softened from clipped military efficiency into the slightly condescending patience he reserved for civilians who didn't know what they were getting into. He told her she had picked an interesting day, that they had army training exercises running all morning, that it might be a bit loud for a beginner session. She told him she didn't mind the noise. He gave her a clipboard and asked if she had ever fired a rifle before. She said once or twice. It wasn't entirely untrue. He assigned her to lane 12, the furthest from the military training area, and told her instructor Mitchell would be with her in 15 minutes. As she made her way to the designated lane, Maya let herself take in the range properly for the first time. It was genuinely impressive. 50 shooting positions stretching across a concrete floor with targets set at various distances up to 1,000 meters. The military section was alive with coordinated activity, soldiers moving through complex shooting scenarios with the fluid confidence of people who had practiced the same movements thousands of times. She recognized the training pattern, recognized the unit designation on their patches, recognized the specific type of advanced reconnaissance exercise they were running, and filed all of this information away automatically, the way a carpenter automatically notices the quality of a joint, or a musician automatically hears when an instrument is slightly out of tune. She set up at lane 12 and waited. Instructor Mitchell arrived with a rifle case and the kind of weathered, unhurried competence that comes from decades of doing one thing very well. He was maybe 55, with the careful economy of movement that ex-military men often carry into civilian life, long after they've stopped wearing the uniform. He opened the case to reveal a Remington 700 with a basic scope. Nothing special, a reliable and accurate rifle that was the standard choice for exactly this kind of introductory instruction. He handed her safety glasses and ear protection and asked what had brought her to rifle shooting. Since most beginners started with handguns, she told him she wanted to challenge herself with something more precise. He accepted this with a nod and began explaining proper stance and grip, and Maya listened with the carefully calibrated attention of someone hearing this information for the first time. She asked questions at appropriate intervals, questions that showed she was paying attention and had basic intelligence, but nothing that would suggest she already knew the answers. In the background, the military training exercise erupted in coordinated gunfire, soldiers engaging multiple targets in rapid succession, their movements practiced and efficient. Mitchell told her not to worry about them, that they were showing off for their colonel. Maya kept her eyes on him and not on the soldiers, which was harder than it should have been. For 20 minutes, Mitchell covered safety protocols, breathing techniques, and sight alignment. He was a good teacher, genuinely patient and precise, and under different circumstances, Maya thought she would have enjoyed the lesson honestly. As it was, she was managing a complicated internal negotiation, trying to figure out exactly how much she could reveal without revealing too much. The plan was to be good. Impressively good for a beginner, good enough to justify the visit, but not so good that questions would be asked that she couldn't answer. The plan, as plans often do, began to come apart the moment she picked up the rifle. There is a particular feeling that comes from holding a tool you know how to use after a long period of not using it. A musician picking up their instrument after months away from it. A chef wrapping their hand around a quality knife after too long cooking with inferior equipment. It is the feeling of rightness, of things being where they are supposed to be, of a part of yourself that has been held carefully in suspension finally being allowed to wake up. When Maya settled the Remington against her shoulder and felt the familiar weight of it, the correct position clicking into place through muscle memory without any conscious direction, she felt that feeling flood through her with a force that was almost physical. She made herself breathe carefully. She made herself slow down. She adjusted the parallax setting, which no beginner would instinctively know to do, then hesitated almost imperceptibly, wondering if Mitchell had noticed. His face showed professional attention and nothing else. She settled into position, took a breath, held it at the natural pause point halfway through the exhale, and squeezed the trigger with the smooth, even pressure that minimized disruption to the aim. The rifle fired, and she knew before the sound had finished echoing that the shot was perfect. Mitchell raised his binoculars. His eyebrows went up. He said, "Well, he be damned, dead center bullseye." He attributed it to beginner's luck. Maya said, "Could they try a further target?" And this was where her carefully constructed plan for restraint began to collapse entirely, because the simple truth was that once she had fired that first shot, she could not make herself shoot badly. It went against something too fundamental in her. The same way a master pianist asked to deliberately play a simple scale might find their fingers gravitating toward complexity, toward the full expression of what they knew. She moved the target to 200 meters and hit it dead center. 300 meters. Dead center. 400 meters. The same. Each shot a small, precise mechanical act, almost effortless. Her body doing what it had been trained over years and under conditions she could not think about to do, while some quieter part of her mind noted with weary resignation that this had been exactly the wrong thing to do, and she had done it. Anyway, by the time she was shooting at 500 meters, the gathering crowd was impossible to ignore even for someone who had Maya's considerable ability to maintain focus under observation. Soldiers from the military section had drifted over during their break, drawn by the news spreading through the range the way news always spreads among people who are trained to pay attention to anomalies. She could hear them talking in the way that people talk when they're trying to be quiet, but the information is too interesting to quite manage it. She caught fragments. Nobody shoots like that. 8 years competitive, and I can't hit 500 consistent. Who is she? Staff Sergeant Brooks called out to Mitchell that his student was making them look bad. Private Torres was less diplomatic. She heard him mutter that nobody shoots like that without serious training, and she thought, quite correctly, that Private Torres was a perceptive young man. She kept her eyes on the target and her breathing steady and her expression neutral, which was something she was very good at. Colonel Blake had been observing the day's training from the elevated observation deck when Lieutenant Carter approached him with the news. Blake was the kind of senior officer who had spent enough years in and around elite units that very little genuinely surprised him anymore. The Army had, over the course of his career, thrown a considerable range of unexpected situations at him, and he had developed a stable, measured response to most of them. But Carter's description of what was happening at Lane 12 penetrated that equanimity more effectively than he would have expected. A bullseye at 500 meters on a first attempt at that distance. From someone presenting herself as a beginner, civilian, he descended to the range floor with the focused attention of a man who has learned that genuine anomalies are rare and worth investigating properly when they occurred. He arrived at Lane 12 in time to see Maya preparing her next shot. Mitchell had set a target at 600 meters, which Blake recognized immediately as a distance that challenged even expert marksmen under ideal conditions. And the conditions this morning were not ideal. There was a crosswind from the northwest that required compensation, and the autumn light was creating the particular kind of visual distortion that made range estimation difficult. Blake had shot competitively for 20 years before his command responsibilities had taken over most of his time, and he knew precisely how difficult the shot Maya was preparing to take actually was. She studied the target through the scope for perhaps 4 seconds, made a minute adjustment that Blake recognized as wind drift compensation, settled into position with the economy of movement that spoke of deep practice, fired. Blake raised his binoculars. Perfect center hit. Not approximately center, not in the bullseye, but slightly off. Not the kind of excellent shot that an exceptional amateur might pull off once under favorable conditions. Dead center, surgical, the kind of shot that made experienced marksmen look at each other, because they understood exactly what they had just witnessed. Blake lowered his binoculars slowly. His mind was already moving through the implications with the rapid, systematic analysis of a man who had spent his career operating in environments where correct assessment of a situation was the difference between mission success and catastrophe. In 15 years of commanding elite units, he had seen shooting like this exactly 3 times. All 3 times, the shooter had been a member of a classified special operations program so far above his security clearance that he had only learned of its existence through the particular kind of osmosis that operates in military intelligence circles, where what is technically unknown becomes practically known through years of proximity to people who do know. The program had trained specialists in skills that went beyond conventional military marksmanship, people whose capabilities were so far outside the normal range that their existence created problems if it became too widely known. The program had been shut down 2 years ago. He knew that much. A security breach, some kind of internal compromise. The details were above his clearance. All he knew was the aftermath, which he knew only because it affected operational planning at the divisional level in ways that required some explanation. All participants had been relocated with new identities. He leaned close to Lieutenant Carter and told him to get a secure line to Intelligence Division immediately, and to tell them that he was calling in reference to Operation Nightfall protocols. Carter looked confused. Carter was 26 years old and efficient and had a bright career ahead of him, but there were categories of classified information that simply hadn't reached his level yet, and Operation Nightfall was one of them. He nodded and went to make the call without asking questions, which was one of the things that made him good at his job. Blake walked slowly to lane 12, his expression professionally neutral, and introduced himself to Maya Johnson. She met his gaze and told him she had been learning. Something in the quality of that gaze told him everything his instincts had already suspected. Behind the quiet exterior, behind the civilian clothes and the unremarkable appearance and the careful performance of ordinary personhood, there was a sharpness that he recognized, the particular awareness of someone who had been trained to read situations at a speed that outpaced conscious analysis, who was already running calculations about him even as she spoke, assessing threat level and escape options and whether the conversation was going where she thought it was going and what she would do if it was. He had seen that look in very few people's eyes. All of them had been elite operators of one kind or another. He asked if they could speak. Privately, she looked at him for a moment and then nodded and set down the rifle. They walked to a quiet corner of the range, away from the curious soldiers who were pretending not to watch and not doing a particularly good job of it. Blake waited until he was confident they were not being heard before he spoke, and then he told her what he knew. He told her about the program, told her about the shutdown, told her about the relocations. He watched her face carefully as he spoke and read in its careful stillness the confirmation that he was right. Then he told her his educated guess about who she was. Not her name, not the name she'd had before Maya Johnson, but the shape of her situation, the broad outlines of what had happened to her and why she was standing in a public shooting range in rural Ohio, instead of wherever she'd come from. Maya was quiet for a long time after he finished. In the distance, the military exercises had resumed, though he could see soldiers still casting glances toward their corner of the range. When she finally spoke, she asked a hypothetical question, phrased carefully in the grammar of plausible deniability. about what would happen to someone in the situation he was describing if their cover was compromised, he told her. New relocation, new identity, the whole process starting again. Somewhere else, someone else. The work of becoming ordinary repeated from the beginning, she said quietly, that sounded exhausting. There was something in the way she said it that was not self-pity, exactly, but was the particular weariness of someone who has been living at the edge of their endurance for long enough that they have stopped being aware of how tired they are. Blake had seen it before, in long-service operators who had spent years in the field without adequate recovery time, people who were still functioning, still effective, but running on reserves that were deeper and more finite than they appeared. He made his decision then, more quickly than such decisions were probably meant to be made. But Blake had spent a career making decisions quickly, and had learned to trust the ones that felt clear. He told her that as far as his official report was concerned, she was a remarkably talented beginner who had impressed everyone with her natural ability. Nothing more. Maya studied his face with the careful attention of someone who has learned that trust is a currency that has to be verified before it's spent. She asked him why he would do that. He told her that sometimes the best soldiers were the ones who got to retire. Quietly. The relief that moved across her face was so brief and so carefully controlled that he almost missed it. But he had spent his career reading people in high-stakes environments, and he caught it. That involuntary microsecond of genuine emotion before the discipline reasserted itself. He knew he had said the right thing. He had one additional request, he told her. His unit could use someone with her particular set of natural talents. Consulting work, training exercises, nothing that would require official status or create a paper trail that led anywhere problematic. The kind of informal arrangement that military units have always had with exceptional civilian experts in various fields. Hypothetically, Maya said she might be interested in something like that. Blake smiled for the first time that day and said he thought she might be. They returned to Lane 12, and what followed over the course of the afternoon was something that the soldiers of the 10th Mountain Division's reconnaissance unit would spend the rest of their careers trying to describe accurately to people who hadn't been there, and mostly failing. The problem was not with their powers of description, but with the inadequacy of language for conveying what it looks like when someone operates at a level that so far exceeds normal human performance that it begins to seem less like an extraordinary version of a familiar thing and more like a different thing entirely. Maya Johnson shot that afternoon, as she had clearly been shooting all morning, with the absolute mechanical precision of someone for whom marksmanship had long since ceased to be a skill and had become something more like a native language, spoken without conscious translation directly from thought into action. She engaged targets at distances that pushed the equipment to its limits. She shot moving targets, calculating lead and bullet drops simultaneously with the ease of long practice. She shot targets partially obscured by obstacles, hitting the exposed portion of each with unhurried accuracy. She demonstrated shooting positions that none of the soldiers present had seen before. Unconventional stances that redistributed weight and tension in ways that improved stability without sacrificing mobility. Positions that looked slightly strange until you saw the results they produced, but what astonished the soldiers more than the shooting itself was the teaching. It became apparent within the first hour of the afternoon session that Maya Johnson's capabilities went considerably beyond her own marksmanship. She had the rarer gift of being able to see with diagnostic precision exactly what each individual shooter was doing wrong, and the rarer gift still of being able to convey the correction in terms that made immediate sense to the specific person receiving it. She adapted her communication style from soldier to soldier with a fluency that made it look effortless, switching between technical anatomical language with some, kinesthetic metaphor with others, visual demonstration where words weren't reaching, quiet individual coaching where group instruction wasn't penetrating, private. Wilson had struggled with long-range accuracy throughout his military career in the way that some people struggle with a foreign language despite years of study, able to function but never quite fluent. Maya watched him take 3 shots at 400 meters, said nothing, watched him take 3 more, and then asked him to show her his natural breathing rhythm at rest. She watched him breathe for 30 seconds and then told him something so specific about the relationship between his particular respiratory pattern and his trigger timing that it was not a general principle but a correction precisely calibrated to his individual physiology. Wilson took his next shot and hit dead center and stood looking at the target for a long moment with the expression of someone who has just heard a piece of music played the way it was meant to be played after years of hearing only inferior versions of it. Corporal Henderson's problem was subtler, a barely perceptible variation in grip, pressure between his left and right hands that introduced a consistent micro-movement at the moment of firing, one that was too small to see with the naked eye but that Maya apparently saw as clearly as if it had been annotated. Her correction took 8 seconds to deliver and produced results that Henderson described afterward, to anyone who would listen, as feeling like someone had finally removed something that had been stuck in his shooting since the beginning without his knowing it was there. Staff Sergeant Brooks, who had been competitive about Maya's shooting from the beginning and was competitive about his own shooting always, approached her during a break with the particular bravado of someone who wants to be impressed but needs to seem reluctant about it. He told her that whatever she was teaching was working, but that he still thought her 3-target rapid sequence from earlier in the day had probably been luck. Maya looked at him for a moment, and then asked him to set up 3 targets at different distances. His choice. Brooks set them up at 300, 500, and 700 meters. Maya engaged all 3 in a sequence that lasted just under 12 seconds. Each shot compensated for different wind drift and bullet drop conditions, each hitting dead center. She put the rifle down and asked him if he would like to learn how she'd done it. Brooks, to his credit, said yes. She spent 40 minutes with him, walking him through the mental architecture of rapid multi-target engagement, the way you hold multiple calculations simultaneously, not by consciously thinking through each one, but by building the mathematics into your perception so that you see the required adjustments the way a musician sees fingering notation automatically, without the slow mediation of deliberate thought. Brooks hit 2 out of 3 on his first attempt at the sequence and 3 out of 3 on his second, and he shook his head slowly and said that in 8 years of competitive shooting, he had never encountered a teaching method like this. And Maya said simply that he was a good student. She demonstrated advanced range estimation methods that didn't require laser rangefinders, using a combination of atmospheric observation and geometric calculation that she walked through step by step with the patience of a mathematics teacher who genuinely enjoys the subject. She showed them how to compensate for temperature and humidity on long shots, factors that most of them had understood theoretically but had never fully integrated into their shooting practice. She introduced breathing techniques adapted from disciplines that had nothing to do with marksmanship, techniques that produced a quality of calm focus that several of the soldiers described later as unlike anything they had previously achieved in high-pressure situations. Through all of it, she remained quiet, unhurried, slightly apart from the group in the way of someone who is accustomed to operating individually and has learned to work with others without quite being of them. She smiled occasionally, genuine small smiles that appeared briefly when a soldier made a breakthrough or asked a particularly good question. She was patient with confusion and precise with correction, and she never once spoke to any of them in a way that suggested impatience or condescension, though she was operating at a level so far above theirs that such an attitude would have been understandable. Colonel Blake observed all of this from a careful distance, not wanting to crowd the informal arrangements she had agreed to, but unable to entirely stay away from something this remarkable. He had spent his career identifying talent and finding ways to develop it, and he understood that what he was watching was extraordinary not just in its quality but in its rarity. People who could do what Maya Johnson was doing on that range, both the shooting and the teaching, existed in very small numbers. The program that had trained her, whatever its other failures had been, had apparently done its central work with exceptional thoroughness. He found himself wondering, not for the first time that afternoon, who she had been before she was Maya Johnson, what operations she had participated in, what she had seen and done and survived that had deposited in her this particular set of capabilities and this particular quality of watchful, self-contained calm. He found himself wondering and then made himself stop, because some questions were not his to ask and some knowledge was not his to have, and this was one of the things he had learned in his career that distinguished the officers who lasted from the ones who didn't dot as the afternoon light shifted toward evening and the soldiers began packing their equipment to return to base. Blake approached Maya one final time. He told her that what had happened on the range that day would be remembered by these soldiers for the rest of their careers. She told him they had earned it because they were willing to learn. He asked if they would see her again. She was quiet for a moment, and then she smiled. The first genuinely unguarded smile he had seen from her all day. A smile that reached her eyes and changed her face in a way that made him understand briefly that the careful, self-contained person he had been talking to all afternoon was a construction, however real and functional, and that somewhere underneath it was someone considerably more present and alive than she allowed herself to appear in ordinary circumstances. She told him that Maya Johnson might find herself developing a serious interest in advanced marksmanship training, that she might become a regular at Riverside Range, that Tuesday mornings might become something she was in the habit of doing. Dope Blake said he hoped very much that she would dot when Lieutenant Carter found him afterward and asked what to put in the official report. Blake stood watching Maya across the range, where she was helping Mitchell clean and secure the equipment with the same methodical precision she had applied to everything else throughout the day. Careful, thorough, leaving no trace of anything out of the ordinary. He told Carter to write that they had encountered a civilian consultant with exceptional natural ability, someone the division would be working with on future training exercises in an informal advisory capacity. Carter waited, and when nothing else came, he said, "That's all?" Blake watched Maya set the last rifle back in its case with hands that held the kind of knowledge that took years to build and a particular kind of life to learn. And he thought about all the things that were true about her that would not appear in any official report, and thought about all the reasons they should not appear there, and thought about what it cost. The particular price of her particular kind of safety, he told Carter. That some secrets were worth keeping, and that this was one of them. The military convoy pulled away from Riverside Range as the sun was dropping toward the tree line, throwing long shadows across the shooting positions. Maya Johnson finished helping Mitchell close up the range, thanked him for his patience with what had been a somewhat irregular instructional session, and walked to her Honda Civic in the parking lot, which was now empty of military vehicles. She sat for a moment before starting the engine, doing the internal accounting that had become habitual over 2 years of careful living. Her cover was not blown. Colonel Blake would keep his word. She was confident of this, not from naivety, but from the specific quality of his character that she had read over the course of the afternoon. The particular kind of integrity that was structural rather than situational, the kind that didn't bend when bending would have been convenient. She had known people like that before, in her previous life, and she knew how to recognize them. She would need to be more careful going forward. Today had demonstrated that the skills she was trying to contain were not as containable as she had hoped, that the itch she had been managing for 2 years was not the kind that could be scratched once and satisfied. She would need, she thought, a more sustainable approach to living with what she knew how to do. Tuesdays, she thought. Tuesdays could be sustainable. She started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot and drove through the October afternoon toward home, toward her quiet apartment and her unremarkable job and the carefully constructed ordinary life that was hers now, that she had come, despite everything, to find something like genuine comfort in. The road stretched ahead through farmland going gold with the season, and the only sounds were the engine and the wind, and in the very far distance, fading as she drove, the last echoes of gunfire from soldiers who were already better at their jobs than they had been when the morning began. The Tuesday sessions that followed became, in the particular oral tradition of elite military units, the kind of thing that was described in careful terms to careful people in careful circumstances. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody filed reports that mentioned it directly. It existed in the currency of trusted speech, passed from soldier to soldier in the way that genuinely useful knowledge always has been and always will be passed among people who understand its value, word spread through military circles in the quiet, specific way that significant things spread among people who are professionally attentive to significant things. A civilian consultant at Riverside Range who could teach shots that weren't in any manual, techniques that had no official source, methods that produced measurable improvements in marksmen who had thought they had already reached their ceiling. People asked where these skills came from. The soldiers who had been there on that first Tuesday, who had seen the beginning of it, who had stood speechless as Maya Johnson demonstrated what it looked like to operate at the absolute upper limit of human capability, would say simply that she was the most talented natural shooter anyone had ever seen, and then they would change the subject with the practiced ease of people who have learned when to close a door, and every Tuesday morning, Maya Johnson made the 3-hour drive to Riverside Range, parked her Honda Civic in the lot, walked into the building with the quiet confidence of someone who belongs somewhere, and spent the morning making the soldiers who protected her country better at doing it. She taught them things that officially she had never learned, and they learned things from a teacher whose real name they would never know, and this arrangement suited everyone involved with a precision that Maya, who had a deep professional appreciation for things that worked exactly as they should, found quietly satisfying. She had been looking, without knowing it, for something exactly like this, a way to be what she was without being destroyed by it, a way to use what she knew without betraying the people who had worked to keep her safe. A purpose that fit the shape of her actual capabilities rather than the shape of her constructed identity. A place where Maya Johnson and the person she had been before that name could coexist without contradiction. She had found it in the most unlikely of places, in a public shooting range on a Tuesday morning between 2 military transport trucks, in front of a crowd of soldiers who would spend the rest of their careers wondering about the quiet woman in the navy blue sweater, who had changed the way they understood what was possible. Some instructors, she thought on the drive home one evening in late November, with the range disappearing in her rearview mirror and the road ahead clear and open, never need to know they're learning from a ghost, some secrets. She reflected, watching the last light fade from the sky ahead of her, are the kindest thing you can give someone and some people. She allowed herself to think, finally, for the first time in 2 years without flinching, find their way home by the most unexpected routes. The road stretched on ahead of her, clear and open all the way to the horizon.